morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone virtually, at least, and to share the results of this really interesting study. I'm going to share my screen because obviously we want to all see the data. But this was quite an interesting study to do, and it's like all studies. There are some things that surprised us. There are some things that didn't surprise us. At a very high level, the good news is that people like living in the city of Hamilton. They think it's a great place to live. To Don on Mike's point, there's a significant amount of concern and anxiety about the cost of housing, the cost of rent, the cost to pay a mortgage, and also when we ask people about the future, we can see that there are a number of different opinions, but the most popular opinion would be to kind of think of expanding the boundary compared to some of the other options. So I'm going to do a bit of a walkthrough, and I'm not going to read all the, what I'll say, technical note, but the key takeaway here is that this is, we did a random telephone survey of land and cell lines. About 70% of the sample were cell lines in order to make sure that there was a diversity of individuals who are residents to share their views. This is the exact same methodology that we use in our election polling that we do for the Globe and CTV News, and it's quite accurate. So we had live people talking to live residents in the city of Hamilton, and we did a representative sample, so it's statistically tested so that we know that it's representative of residents in the city of Hamilton. 700 residents were in the study, and it's accurate plus or minus 3.7 percentage points, 19 times out of 20. The other thing that's important, and I get this question asked a lot, I wrote the questions, as in this guy wrote the questions. And for those of you that work with me, you know that I can be difficult many times, but I'm a big believer that the research has to be bulletproof. It has to be and we have to have 100% confidence based on the methodology that we've used and the questions that we've asked and the phrasing of the questions and the order of the questions. I'm very confident that this is an accurate representation of the opinion of Hamilton residents at the time of the survey. So let's just start to kind of unpack things. You can see we tested on views on a number of different dimensions about living in Hamilton, and you can see, and the positive news is that the dimension that actually scored the highest, and we had people score on a 10-point scale, where 0 was a very poor rating and 10 was a very good rating, and you can see that the top score among Hamilton residents was that Hamilton was a really great place, a good place to raise a family, with about 45% of the sample saying that. The second kind of tier of things that people liked about living in the city of Hamilton is the view that it was safe, and that came second. But check out what's at the bottom of the list. Hamilton is a place where one can afford to buy a home. 43% of residents in the city outright scored Hamilton very poor on this measure, and only 9% thought it was good. And to put this into context, many times I look at the negatives compared to the positives. So to put this into context, when we look at Hamilton as a place to raise a family, people are 5 times more likely to think positively than negatively on that particular dimension of being in Hamilton. But when you look at Hamilton as a place where one can afford to buy a home, you can see that people are 4 times more likely to score negatively rather than positively. And I'm going to also walk through some of the demographics on this. But you can see on the job market front, marginally positive scores on that front. No big difference from a demographic perspective, but you can see that only 22% rate the job market in Hamilton as very good, while 8% score it as very poor. When it comes to raising a family, you can see that when we look at things that, the older that you are, the more likely you are to kind of score positively on this measure. And that kind of makes sense. It means that people who are longstanding residents of the city of Hamilton actually have positive views about raising a family because of the experiences that they have. And you can see that, the people that are over 55 years of age are much more likely to score that positively than people that are younger. So it's positive on that front. On safety, at least, No big difference on the demographic front. Very similar views of men and women, and generationally on this, and whether you have children or not. Still net positive. You can see that only 9% rate this negatively, while 34%, more than 3 times as many Hamilton residents rate Hamilton as a safe place to live as positive rather than negative. So that's good. Place to take public transit. Still net positive on that front, about 3 times as positive as negative. The other thing is check out the number for renters. Renters were more likely to score public transit and positive scores on public transit compared to homeowners, but still homeowners had a fairly decent score, but one noticeable difference on that front. Now, this is the kicker question: afford to buy a home. You can see here, at least, that the younger you are, the more likely you are to have a negative score on this. And the other thing is that if you happen to be a renter, you're more likely to give a lower score, only a 3.8 out of 10 compared to homeowners. And even the homeowners score, for all intents and purposes, is quite weak. But the key takeaway here, and this is fairly consistent with the research that we've done in the GTA and nationally on housing affordability. This is housing affordability is a major issue for Canadians. They're very worried about the cost to rent, about the cost to carry a mortgage, and the cost of housing. And this type of trend that we're seeing across the country, and especially in large cities, also manifests itself in Hamilton for sure. And the interesting thing is that when you start to unpack this, you can see that people are 10 times more likely in the city of Hamilton to think that the value of real estate will increase at 64% compared to decrease at only 6%. So, the folks who live in the city of Hamilton understand that the market right now is hot. A lot of that has had to do with the pandemic, based on a lot of the research that we've done, where there are many Canadians looking at kind of changing the type of housing that they're living in, because they're teleworking, because they want a backyard, all those kinds of things, and realizing that kind of the nature of the things that they need is changing. And as a result, more Canadians are active in the real estate market now compared to many other times. But basically, the key takeaway here is a significant amount of perceptions related to the rising cost of the rising value of real estate. And check out the generational numbers. If you happen to be 18 to 34, but almost 3 out of every 4 of those think that the value is going to go up. While if you happen to be over 55, still a majority, slight majority, but not that same level of intensity. And this is I'll call this the killer question in terms of concern about the cost of housing and affordability. Check this out. You can see 66% of residents outright are concerned, and another 16% are somewhat concerned, and only 15 and 1% actually don't have any type of high level of concern. And check out the numbers demographically. You can see that if you are 18 to 34, the proportion that are concerned or somewhat concerned about housing costs in Hamilton goes up to a whopping 86%. And the other thing is that it looks like women are more concerned than men about the cost of housing. And what we do know is that this is on the agenda. If you look at the last federal election, for example, every single federal party had a program or a platform to try to manage and influence affordable housing, whether it be the cost to rent or the cost to buy a home. It's because there's an acknowledgement that this is important. And the interesting thing is in my experience, I've been doing polling for more than 30 years. This is the first election that I've ever done polling in where housing was actually a top issue like this and actually influenced and dominated the agenda for a certain period of time. Usually it's things like the environment, right? Jobs, the economy, healthcare, right? But in this election, housing was basically a breakthrough issue for Canadians. They wanted to hear from all of their elected officials, and this was, we're basically in exceptional times, and it speaks to the fact a lot of these other issues are important, right? The environment obviously is important, but I'll tell you something. if someone can't pay the rent in the next 30 days, if someone can't pay the mortgage in the next 30 days, yes, the environment is important, and they'll say that it's important, but there's a certain sense of urgency on this particular issue compared to a lot of other issues. And I think that's why so many Canadians and politicians are engaged on this. And, to put this into context, in a study that we did just before the federal election for Vote Housing, which is a housing organization, that study suggested that 4.9 million Canadians weren't sure whether they'd be able to pay the rent or pay the mortgage in the next 30 days, just to put that into context. So this is not to say that other issues like the environment or preserving farmland or things like that are not important. Yes, they're important. But if you can't pay the rent, if you can't pay the mortgage in the next 30 days, this is what people really want to hear about. Those other things are important, but this has a different magnitude of importance. And it's very important to kind of to look at that. And, you can basically, see the same type of thing in terms of the cost of rent, significant level of concern rate across the board. You can see among renters exceptionally high at 87%. And, we asked the type of housing that people currently lived in. So this is kind of a little bit more of a profiling question, but you can see a lot of single detached homes and a diversity of housing that folks in Hamilton live in. But what's interesting is that when we ask, so think of it this way, I'll go back a second. So 60% live in a single detached home, but when we ask them, what type of home would you prefer to live in? Check it out, that jumps up to 75%. So perhaps one of the key things, and I think this is a byproduct of the pandemic, whether good, bad, or otherwise. One of the byproducts of the pandemic is that there's an increasing number of Canadians that want to live in single detached family homes. They want to have space, not just from a public health perspective, but to be able to work and for their kind of family to have a good family life. And I think one of the outcomes from the pandemic is that for many of those Canadians that are looking at changing the type of housing that they live in, they're looking at things that are more resilient from a pandemic perspective and more flexible in terms of work and teleworking. And as a result, single detached homes having an increase in terms of appetite. This was one of the questions that I would say I found quite striking in terms of the numbers, especially when you think of it this way. All the questions of the report are presented in the order that they were asked. And the other thing is it's important to know that what we have here is basically a really interesting snapshot of opinion. So just think of it this way: people told us, "Hey, Hamilton's a great place to raise a family. They like living in Hamilton. They like different aspects. They're concerned about housing affordability." And then, when we asked this question on, if your preferred type of housing wasn't available or you couldn't afford it, what would you do? Would you consider moving? And I think this particular question should give anyone that cares about Hamilton a bit of a pause. 76% of people in Hamilton would consider, that's 3 out of every 4, would consider moving to another community, not because they didn't like Hamilton, but because they couldn't afford or couldn't find the housing that they wanted. And the thing is that check out that number for young people, 89%, 9 out of 10 young people that live in Hamilton that believe that Hamilton's also a great place to live and to raise a family would leave to a nearby community. It's not because they want to, but I think from their perspective, it's because they have no choice. But if they can't afford to pay the rent in the house that they need or the housing that they need, or can't afford to pay the mortgage for the house that they'd like to have, the single detached house, they're going to say, they're going to be sad, but they're going to leave, and they'll consider moving. And I think this is quite important, I think, for everyone to really understand that elected officials are responsible for making public policy decisions, but these public policy decisions sometimes can have unintended consequences. No one designs a policy thinking that they want to drive people out of the city. But the fact of the matter is if Hamilton does not have a good strategy for affordable housing, for people to be able to afford the rent and to be able to afford to own a home, then young people will leave. And other people will leave to find the housing in neighboring communities that they want and that they can afford. And I think that's quite important on in terms of whatever the path forward is that the city decides to take. You know, we also tested on support for building more homes or apartments in the immediate neighborhood, and this is kind of like the "not in my backyard" syndrome. Actually, division, right? You can see 36% support and another 16% somewhat support. So right, that's 52%. So marginal majority, but still a significant proportion, 41% oppose or somewhat oppose what I'll say, building more homes or apartment buildings in their immediate neighborhood. You know, and I think a lot of this has to do with, you know, many people in Hamilton like the neighborhoods that they live in. And you know what, the thing is for those that want to get into the market, they like the neighborhoods in Hamilton. They want more of those neighborhoods and more choice, so to speak, so that they can have the same type of lifestyle and living in many of the great neighborhoods in Hamilton that other people already have. But right now, housing affordability and what I'll say availability of inventory are an impediment to that. So this was the one question that has to do with choices and directions. And we presented basically three options: keeping the boundary the same and fitting the additional people into the current neighborhoods. So that's basically a kind of intensification. Allowing an expansion of the urban boundary to accommodate additional people, slowing down growth in Hamilton. And you know what you see here is that the top response at 38%, so almost 4 out of every 10 would of residents would be good with allowing an expansion of the urban boundary to accommodate additional people. After that, you can see that 1 out of every 3 almost wanted to keep the boundary the same. 22% wants to slow down growth. And, you know, some people might think, well, let's start mixing and matching things together, you know, adding 2 numbers together to get a majority. I don't like doing things like that because basically what's important for us to understand is that there is a diversity of opinion, but the most popular opinion is to allow an expansion of the urban boundaries. That there are people that want things to slow down, and there are people that want the boundary to stay the same, but there happen to be more residents in the city of Hamilton today, at least, that are okay with an expansion of the urban boundary to accommodate additional people. So this is the type of question that many people, everyone will be disappointed at, and usually when everyone's disappointed, that means that it's probably an accurate depiction of public opinion. But the key takeaway here is that faced with comparative choices, the most popular one is to allow an expansion of the urban boundary. And, you know, when you see kind of some of the demographic breakdowns between allowing the expansion of the urban boundary versus keeping the boundary the same, older residents are more likely to want to keep the boundary the same, but check out the numbers. There's basically a significant generational divide where in terms of the expansion, if you are younger, under 35 years of age, you can see that number jumps up to 50.9% among young people. This means that, you know, for anyone that decides to advocate for an expansion of the urban boundary, this is something about young people, about young families, about young people that want to live in Hamilton and kind of set a future in Hamilton, and how they see that as the as kind of like their desired path, compared to, you can see only 26.8% of young people would want to keep the boundary the same. So not quite a factor of 2 to 1, but almost a factor of 2 to 1. And you know, I think that's one of the key takeaways. So, you know, that's what we found when it came to what I'll say paths forward. And on the slowdown in new growth, you know, that was the least desired, but still significant. More likely to be popular among older residents than younger residents. Maybe one of the ways to think about it is that the older residents in Hamilton don't want change, and that young people think about Hamilton as a vibrant community to raise a family, and how can it stay relevant and vibrant in order to do that, and how can they stay in Hamilton, the place where they want to stay, assuming that the places that they want to buy actually exist and are enforceable. This was the question that we asked about the city of Hamilton's survey, the official survey that they sent out on that topic. And I was quite surprised, considering how much this has been in the news, and the engagement of city council and many citizens with the diversity of opinions, the engagement on this, that only 1 out of every 5 actually recall receiving a questionnaire. And I think this should cause pause, at least, for that survey, as basically kind of like one of those surveys that anybody, that our people self-select, is not necessarily representative. And we should basically take with a big rock piece of salt, so to speak, in terms of thinking that that's representative of opinion. So there's a difference between a survey where people can self-select. I'd always kind of say, do you know what? If you actually want to do out a survey, there's something wrong with you. Think of it this way. The way we do our survey, we randomly select people. They can't volunteer. And then they do the survey. And then we check to see whether that responding group, how similar it is to the actual population. And because it's similar, we have a high level of confidence that we've captured a diversity of views, as opposed to people who are just hot on the topic, who self-select themselves because they have very strong opinions. So maybe another way to think of this scientific survey, at least, is that it puts a spotlight on the silent majority. The silent majority that think that Hamilton's a great place to raise a family. The silent majority that is concerned about the rising cost of housing. The silent majority that wants to live, but that will make those tough decisions to leave Hamilton if they can't afford to pay the rent and get the house that they need. And it's not because they don't like Hamilton, it's because they have no choice. So I think that's probably one way to contextualize the survey, that this survey actually captures the silent majority of Hamiltonians who love the city, are worried about the cost, and want to see action, at least, so that they can stay in Hamilton and raise their families. I'm not going to read all this because it's all in the report, but the key takeaways here is that the expansion of the urban boundary is comparatively more popular than the other choices, but the other paths forward. But there's still noticeable people that support those other two, but they're just less popular. The recall from the survey of the city of Hamilton is quite low, in my opinion, and there should be a bit of a cautionary note whenever thinking that that is gospel, because it is not scientific and people are self-selected. And I would just be a little hesitant, at least. I will not make any other comment on that survey because of the flaw in the survey, and it just doesn't make sense for me to make any comment on the results of that survey, other than to point out that there's a problem. And the other key takeaway is if the city messes this up, people will leave, period, full stop. Not because they want to, not because they don't like Hamilton. They'll basically be forced out because they won't be able to find any housing that they can afford. And that housing is on the agenda. All the issues, and this is a complex issue. It includes choices about the environment, it includes choices about agricultural land. All those things are very important. But I'll tell you something, if you can't pay the bills, that takes priority. So this survey does not really diminish the importance of all those other factors on this issue that are quite important. What it just does is to put into context what people want, what the silent majority want. And yes, they want an environment, they want farmland, they want all that stuff. But if you can't pay the rent, that's another magnitude of issue. So my key takeaway and message, at least for everyone here, is to think about the opportunity that Hamilton has, that people love living in Hamilton. They want to live in Hamilton. They want to raise their family in Hamilton, but there's a problem. And I'll leave it at that.